The streets of London in the early 1530s were buzzing with unease. England stood under the iron grip of King Henry VIII, whose hunger for power was matched only by his paranoia. Betrayal, treachery, and whispers of poison haunted the royal court, for in a kingdom where food and drink flowed freely, poison had become the weapon of choice for those who dared strike at the powerful. The king, already infamous for his merciless punishments, decided that the act of poisoning would not be treated like any other crime. Thieves were hanged, traitors drawn and quartered, but poisoners, he believed, deserved a death that was slow, public, and unforgettable. It was not enough to kill them, it was necessary to make them an example. And so in 1531, a new law was written into England's history. Any man or woman convicted of poisoning, whether guilty of attempting murder or succeeding in it, would be boiled alive. It was not a rumor whispered in the shadows, but an official decree read aloud by heralds in crowded marketplaces. The people trembled at the thought, for even in a world where executions were common, this was something darker. The first to face this punishment was a cook by the name of Richard Roose, servant in the household of a prominent bishop. Roose was accused of lacing a pot of porridge with poison, which left 2 people dead and many others gravely ill. Whether guilty or framed, his fate was sealed the moment his crime was declared. Poison was seen not just as murder, but as sorcery, a hidden evil that struck silently. News of his sentence spread across London like wildfire. Markets fell silent when the criers proclaimed it. Mothers clutched their children, warning them of the dangers of wickedness. Merchants whispered that this punishment was worse than the gallows, worse even than burning. Boiling was meant not simply to kill, but to terrify. On the day of his execution, Smithfield, the ground where countless heretics had already met their end, became the stage for this new theatre of cruelty. The scaffold was not prepared with ropes or axes, but with a massive iron cauldron suspended above roaring flames. Beneath it, wood crackled and popped as the fire grew hotter, fed by eager hands who wanted to see the king's justice carried out. The crowd gathered long before the appointed hour. Men pushed forward, women craned their necks, and children were hoisted onto shoulders. Vendors sold pies and ale, as though this spectacle were no different from a fair or festival. But behind the chatter was a nervous energy, a sense that they were about to witness something that would burn itself into their minds forever. Roose was dragged to the platform, shackled and pale, his eyes darting across the sea of faces. Some jeered, shouting that he deserved it. Others watched in uneasy silence, for the sight of a man about to be boiled alive was not so easily met with cheers. Even in an age of brutality, this punishment felt like stepping into hell itself. The executioner stoked the fire, and steam began to rise from the cauldron. The smell of heated metal and scalding water carried over the crowd. Soldiers kept the masses at bay, though many pressed forward, desperate for a clearer view. This was history in the making, and they wanted to be close enough to taste the fear in the air. When the moment came, the executioner and his assistant seized Roose and dragged him to the edge of the cauldron. The prisoner's screams pierced the square as he struggled, but his chains bound him fast. With brute force, they hoisted him up and plunged him into the bubbling water. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Roose shrieked, his skin blistering at once as the boiling liquid swallowed him. Steam hissed as his body thrashed, the sound of his agony echoing across Smithfield. Mothers covered their children's eyes, though many children peeked through trembling fingers, unable to look away. But the king's decree demanded not mercy, but spectacle. Roose was not plunged to his death in one swift motion. Instead, the executioner raised him up again, his body already scalded and red, before lowering him back into the cauldron. The crowd gasped at the cruelty of it, for the man's cries no longer sounded human. The torture went on for what felt like eternity. Each time he was lowered, his skin peeled and bubbled, the smell of cooked flesh spreading through the air. Some in the crowd retched, others wept, and yet many still roared with approval, shouting that the king's justice was mighty. In this moment, fear bound them tighter to their monarch. Finally, after long, drawn-out minutes of horror, Roose ceased to move. His voice was gone, his body limp, though the bubbling water continued to rise and fall with the steam of death. Only when he was utterly still did the executioner let him sink for the final time, until nothing remained but silence and the hiss of boiling water. The crowd dispersed slowly, shaken yet enthralled. For days afterward, Smithfield echoed with tales of what they had seen. Some claimed it was righteous, that poisoners deserved no better. Others muttered that England had crossed a line, that such cruelty belonged more to the dungeons of foreign tyrants than the heart of London. Yet the king was satisfied. The message was clear. To poison was not simply to kill, but to betray all of society, and betrayal would be answered not with death alone, but with fire, steam, and agony. Richard Roose had become the first example of Henry's new law, but he would not be the last. As the memory of that boiling lingered in the minds of the people, fear spread through kitchens, taverns, and marketplaces. To cook for another became an act laced with suspicion. And in the shadow of Henry's rule, the cauldron waited, ready to consume the next unfortunate soul who dared raise a hand with poison. The death of Richard Roose had not been a simple execution. It had been a performance of fear. Word of the boiling spread beyond London, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and travellers to every corner of England. In taverns and marketplaces, people whispered about the cook who had screamed as his flesh melted away, and how King Henry's justice had turned the stomachs of even the most hardened spectators. But the king was not swayed by pity. Henry VIII believed poison was the weapon of cowards, one that crept silently into food and drink, impossible to defend against. To his mind, boiling was not cruelty, but justice, a punishment equal to the treachery of the crime. He had no intention of ending the practice after Roose. Rather, the king intended it to stand as a permanent law. Soon another case brought the boiling pot back into use. In the year 1542, a man named Margaret Davy, a maidservant, was accused of poisoning her mistress. Whether guilty or merely accused by circumstance, her fate was sealed the moment the charge left her neighbor's lips. Poisoning was now too dangerous a crime to be doubted, and the king's courts wasted no time in ordering her execution. Smithfield was prepared once again. By now, the sight of a giant cauldron raised over a roaring fire had become infamous. Crowds gathered even earlier, for many who had missed Rose's boiling were eager, morbidly eager, to witness this second demonstration. Some came to be entertained, others to be horrified, but all came because no one could resist the lure of such a grim spectacle. Margaret was brought to the scaffold, bound in ropes, her face pale as chalk. The crowd shouted vile names at her, though in the murmurs there was also unease. She was a woman, and executions of women in this manner were rare. Still, mercy had no place in Henry's reign. She would boil just as Roose had boiled. The cauldron this time was filled not only with water, but with oil, a thicker, deadlier bath that clung to the flesh like fire itself. The executioner stirred it with a long iron pole, the surface spitting and hissing like a beast hungry for its prey. The smell of burning wood and hot fat rolled over the crowd, making some gag before the execution even began. When Margaret was hoisted over the cauldron, she wailed, begging for her life. Some in the crowd turned their faces away, unable to watch a woman suffer in such a manner. But the king's officers made certain that her cries were drowned by the sound of the trumpets, announcing the beginning of her death. With a great heave, the executioner lowered her into the boiling oil. Her scream split the air so sharp that many swore it echoed across London's rooftops. Her body twisted and thrashed, the oil bubbling furiously as her flesh blistered. Unlike water, the oil clung to her skin, burning deeper with each second she remained submerged. The crowd was caught between horror and fascination. Mothers clutched their children tightly, and yet many eyes remained fixed on the scene, unable to turn away. The stench of burning skin was overpowering, and some fainted where they stood. But Henry's men held the line, ensuring no one left until the punishment was complete. Like Roose before her, Margaret was not lowered all at once. She was raised up, her skin blackened and slick, then plunged again into the oil. Her screams grew weaker, more ragged, as her body slowly gave way to the agony. Each time she surfaced, her form was less human, her face twisted in pain and horror. It took long, drawn-out minutes before Margaret finally fell silent. Her limp body hung over the cauldron, steam rising from her like smoke from a ruined feast. Only then did the executioner lower her for the final time, letting the oil consume her completely. The square was silent but for the crackling fire. When the crowd dispersed, London carried the memory of her cries for weeks. Some said they could still hear her voice in the hiss of boiling kettles at home. Others swore the air of Smithfield stank of oil and flesh long after the execution was done. Fear spread through households, for if a maidservant could be boiled, then no one was beyond suspicion. Henry's law had worked, at least in the eyes of the crown. The kingdom was gripped by terror and poisonings grew rarer, but the people did not see justice in the boiling cauldrons. They saw cruelty, and they whispered that England was now ruled by a monarch who delighted in fire and steam. Foreign visitors recorded their shock, writing of how England boiled men and women alive as though it were a common practice. Continental courts, already critical of Henry's excesses, used it as evidence of his tyranny. Yet within his borders, no one dared challenge him. The boiling pot had become as much a symbol of his reign as the axe or the rope. As the years passed, each new boiling reinforced the fear that lived in England's kitchens and dining halls. Servants looked suspiciously at masters, and masters at their servants. To dine in another man's house was no longer a simple matter of courtesy, but an act shadowed with dread. The king's decree had not only killed its victims, it had poisoned trust itself. The boiling deaths, though rare in number, echoed far louder than the many hangings and beheadings of Henry's reign. They etched themselves into the collective memory of the people, shaping a legacy of cruelty that would outlast the king. For in England, during those grim years, the crackle of fire and the hiss of boiling oil became the sound of justice. By the mid-16th century, the boiling law had carved a deep scar across England's memory. Though only a handful of poisoners ever faced the cauldron, the very thought of it was enough to chill the blood. For the people, it stood as the darkest symbol of Henry VIII's reign, a punishment that did not kill swiftly but tore screams from its victims until their voices broke. After the execution of Margaret Davy, the law remained written, though rarely enacted. It loomed like a storm cloud over the courts, ready to be summoned whenever the crown deemed necessary. To many, its rarity made it worse. The boiling pot was not an everyday terror, but a shadow that could suddenly appear when least expected. Even after Henry's death in 1547, the cauldron's threat lingered. His successors inherited not just the throne, but his laws. Edward VI and later Mary I were heirs to a kingdom still haunted by the smell of boiling oil. Though neither monarch employed the punishment as often, the memory of Smithfield's cauldrons remained fresh in the minds of Londoners. Whispers filled the city whenever a case of poisoning emerged. Was the cauldron being readied? Would another soul scream as their flesh melted away? The law stood as both warning and promise. To poison was to be boiled, and the people lived in dread that they might once again see the iron pot raised above the fire. Yet as the years dragged on, voices began to question the necessity of such cruelty. Even in an age when hangings, burnings, and beheadings were commonplace, the boiling deaths stood apart. They were not only barbaric, but theatrical in their horror, designed less for justice and more for spectacle. Some began to murmur that it was too much, even for England. Foreign visitors wrote with disgust about the law. Ambassadors from Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire described it as a stain on England's honor. They chronicled how men and women screamed as they boiled alive, and how the crowds trembled afterward. To outsiders, England seemed a land of savagery masquerading as justice. Still, the punishment remained, silent, but waiting. It was not until the reign of Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, that the law truly faded. Elizabeth, though no stranger to executions, had little use for boiling cauldrons. She understood that her kingdom's strength came not from spectacle, but from control and careful governance. Poisoners were still punished, but with the rope, the axe, or the stake, never again with the pot. By the late 16th century, the law against poisoners was quietly repealed. The cauldron was set aside, left to rust, its fire extinguished. England returned to its more ordinary executions, where death was brutal but familiar. The boiling deaths became stories, whispered like ghost tales in taverns and around hearths. Yet the memory refused to die. For decades, old Londoners spoke of the day they had seen Roose shriek in Smithfield, or the day Margaret Davy's screams echoed above the market stalls. Parents told their children of the boiling pot as a warning. Never turn to poison, for the king's justice would find you in fire and steam. The cauldron itself became almost mythic. Some said it still sat buried beneath Smithfield, its iron blackened and warped from the flames. Others swore it had been melted down and recast into church bells, so that with every toll, the cries of the boiled lived on in the sound. The truth was less dramatic. It was dismantled, its pieces scattered, but the legend endured. Historians of later centuries would look back on the boiling deaths with unease. They asked whether Henry's decree was born of justice or merely of fear. Poison had terrified the king because it was invisible, a danger that no sword or shield could block. His punishment then was meant to terrify in return, an answer to hidden death with public agony. But for the people who lived through it, there was little philosophy to be found. They remembered the screams, the smell, and the sight of human flesh blistering in oil. They remembered how even hardened men wept, how women fainted, and how children carried the nightmares into adulthood. It was not justice they recalled, but cruelty. In the centuries that followed, the boiling deaths faded into the darker corners of England's history. They became a relic, cited alongside the rack and the thumbscrew as proof of mankind's capacity for torment. But unlike many punishments, boiling was never revived. It was too monstrous, too raw, too scarring even for an age drenched in blood. Yet the shadow of the cauldron lingers still in the collective imagination. The very phrase, "boiled alive," carries a chill, conjuring visions of Smithfield Square, the crackle of fire, and the scream of Richard Roose as the water swallowed him. It remains one of the most terrible punishments ever sanctioned by English law. Henry VIII had wanted to make poisoners fear him more than death itself. In that he succeeded. But he also left England with a legacy of horror, a reminder that power without restraint can turn justice into something darker. The boiling deaths did not protect his people from poison. They only reminded them that a king's wrath could be as cruel as any crime. And so, in the story of England, the boiling pot stands as both punishment and warning. It was not just a cauldron of oil or water. It was a vessel of terror, a symbol of a king who ruled by fire and fear. Though centuries have passed, its memory still bubbles beneath the surface of history, waiting to be remembered.